I remember my granddad, who was an officer in the Navy in World War II.
I remember my great-grandfather, James Wright, who fought in the Royal Lancashire Fusiliers in World War II.
I remember my granddad Joe. He served in the Lancashire Fusiliers and he was captured in Singapore in 1942 and he spent a number of years in a prisoner of war camp. And I also remember my great-granddad who served in the First World War and he was in the Royal Army Veterinary Corps and he was quite short. It kind of runs in the family, but he wasn't even 5 foot tall. And he was a runner between trenches and he also worked with dogs and horses and pigeons and he was laying cables, communication cables.
I remember my great uncle Thomas Billington, who was killed in World War II.
I remember my grandfather's cousin Ronald Parker, who was killed in the early hours of D-Day.
We remember our great-grandfather, Thomas Horsfield,
who served in the D-Day landing on Sword Beach.
I remember my great-grandfather, Albert, who served on the Normandy landing, and my grandfather who fought and helped in the Cyprus emergency. And I myself was an ACF Army Cadet.
Okay, so I'm remembering my granddad, who's called William Beattie. He was in the Sherwood Rangers Infantry and he was in the D-Day landings at Gold Beach. He was one of the first crews to land at Gold Beach for D-Day. He had a really horrible job to do during the war for some of the time. At any rate, working with a man called Reverend Leslie Skinner, and part of his job was to recover bodies that had been killed in tank bombings and things. He had to collect those bodies so that they could be buried, so that they could have a proper burial.
I remember Guardsman Jackson, who served in Northern Ireland, Afghanistan, Iraq and Buckingham Palace.
Layla Fender remembers Ian Fender, who served 40 years as a submarine commodore.
I remember my grandfather Anthony Lowe, who fought in Cyprus in the Suez Crisis.
I remember my great-great-uncle Cyril, who was killed just before Armistice Day in the First World War and who has never been found. And also my great-uncle Bert, who flew 50 missions with Bomber Command in the RAF in the Second World War. He was one of the lucky ones. Only 44% of Bomber Command survived. He lived to a grand old age of 100 and had a RAF fly past on his 100th birthday.
I remember my cousin Shindy training as a paratrooper and then shortly after that being deployed to the Middle East as part of the Gulf War. Very worrying time for everybody involved, but equally we were very proud that he was defending our freedoms.
I remember my great-granddad fought during World War II and was captured in North Africa, and my brother who is currently serving in the military.
I remember my father-in-law being a cook for the British Army in World War II.
I remember my dad serving in the army for 12 years in the bomb disposal, and my great-granddad serving in the army in Berlin.
I remember great-granddad George Clark lied about his age to fight in World War I. I also had a granddad who fought in Palestine, whilst I had uncles who fought in the army.
I remember my dad who served active duty in Bosnia, Croatia and Northern Ireland.
I remember my dad, Petty Officer Alan Farquharson, who fought in the Royal Navy in several conflicts after World War II, including Aden, Northern Ireland and the Falklands War. I also remember my uncle Colin Farquharson, Killick Gunner, who fought in the Royal Navy in the Falklands. I also remember my brother, who is currently serving in the Middle East, and has fought in conflicts in Africa, Afghanistan, Kosovo and all over the Middle East.